Okay, 7 o'clock everyone, and welcome to this, our 10th virtual sea angling forum and the 6th with an IFCA. I'm Nevin Hunter, and I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Jon Butler, Head of Operations at the Eastern IFCA, with Stephen Thompson, the Marine Science Officer, and Alan Garnham, who's an Inshore Fisheries Conservation Officer and a passionate sea angler. So welcome to you all. Working in the background with me tonight is Hannah Rudd, who is our Policy and Advocacy Officer, and Hannah will be dealing with the Q&As. But before I hand over to Jon, can I just explain how the evening will run? Jon's going to give a presentation using PowerPoint, effectively in part 1 of the evening, and then Hannah will pose questions that you, the audience, can ask. You can write the questions in the Q&A box on your screen as Jon presents and during the Q&A session itself. Stephen will then present on fishing for data, and this will be followed by another Q&A session led by Hannah. And upon conclusion of the Q&A session, I will then come back on screen to close the evening. Throughout the evening, I'll be hoping to ensure there are no technical issues, and will be in the background doing that. Just to let you know as well, the forum is being recorded and will be available to watch as soon as we can download it to the Angling Trust website after the event. So finally, if I can just welcome, please, Jon, and please go ahead with your presentation, Jon. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Just bear with me a second while I get the screen up. Can you see that, Nevin?
Yep, we can see that. That's great, Jon. Thank you.
I do apologise, Nevin. It's picked the wrong one up. There. Can we see that now, Nevin?
Yeah, that's all live. So
thank you.
Go ahead, Jon. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. My name's Jon Butler. As Nevin introduced me, I'm the Head of Operations for Eastern IFCA. Apologies from our CEO, Julian Gregory. Unfortunately, he's on annual leave this week, so he's handed the presentation over to me this evening. I have got 2 officers with me. My role as Head of Operations is to oversee different elements of the IFCA. I'm not necessarily the person that deals with the policy, but I do oversee the 2 teams, which is the enforcement team and the science team. So I've got 2 people from those teams that potentially, if we've got any questions, will also be able to assist. Anything we can't answer tonight, we will respond through the Angling Trust website. So welcome. Eastern IFCA's vision, as all IFCAs have, is to lead, champion and manage a sustainable marine environment and inshore fisheries by successfully securing the right balance between social, environmental and economic benefits to ensure healthy seas, sustainability, fisheries and a viable industry. And I think as we go through this presentation, I think one of the things I'd like to point out, it is about that balance. We have lots of partners, lots of stakeholders, and it's trying to find the right balance across all of those to manage our IFCA districts. So sometimes we can't get that right. Sometimes people say, well, why aren't you doing this? And others will be saying, why aren't you doing that? So we've got to draw a line sometimes, and sometimes we have to make decisions that aren't popular. Our district is a very large district. You can see on the map, Easton is probably one of the largest. The Wash itself is only 14 miles across from Hunstanton, where I'm currently looking across to Skegness myself at the moment. But the embayment is a large body of water that actually, if it was stretched out, would increase our district area. I think we worked out the other day in the office that to drive from Horseshoe Point, which is up in the north of our district, down to Felixstowe Harwich would take us the best part of approximately 3.5–4 hours. So it is a large area to cover, with a number of diverse fisheries and diverse communities along the coast to work with. As an authority, very similar to other IFCAs, we're member-led. Officers inform the decision making of the authority. We as officers don't make the decisions. That's very much put through the authority, and they vote on that and make those decisions. But we've got 7 councillors. Our IFCA is funded by the 3 county councils of Lincolnshire, Norfolk and Suffolk, and they have respective representatives on the committee. Our committee is chaired by local members, and that's taken on rotation. So our current chair is a Norfolk County councillor, Tom Fitzpatrick, and the vice chair is a Suffolk County councillor. In addition to that, we've got 12 MMO appointees, and they're made up from a variety of different backgrounds. They're there to inform the authority. They're not there to represent their own individual areas. So we have NGOs, we have fishing industry representatives, we have representatives who have got interest in recreational sea angling, we have past-had divers. So it's to try to give us a broad range of people that use and access the sea in our district. In addition, we've got 2 additional members from Natural England and the EA. Our current staff complement, and this does look big, but when you break it down, you realise over the huge area that we're covering, we are stretched. So we've currently got 7 marine protection officers, so IFCOs, but we're currently carrying 2 vacancies in the team. At the moment, I've actually got 2 people isolating due to being pinged by COVID. We've got 3 officers within the project team, and they particularly look at the regulation side and how we're going to implement our management. We've got 8 officers within the marine science team, and then there's the support team and the execs. We are a seagoing organisation. A number of years ago, we made the decision to get rid of our large, expensive to run patrol vessel, and we replaced that with 2 smaller cabin ribs, 11-metre cabin ribs, John Allen and Sebastian Terralink. They're based either at Sutton Bridge or at Lowestoft, but we do move those around the district. We've currently got an older 18-metre catamaran 3 counties who has served the time with us, and we've actually just commissioned a new research vessel which is being built locally at Good Child Marine in Yarmouth to hopefully see us through the next 30 years and beyond, hopefully, of whatever comes our way as IFCAs, whether we move further offshore, whether our remit's expanded, but it gives us a much better platform to carry out both our enforcement activities and our research activities. We've also got a small rib which is currently down in the Suffolk area, which is very useful for patrolling the rivers and some of the inland waterways. We do work with a lot of partners, and we'll be working with Norfolk Police to share that asset over the summer. We have a fleet of land-based assets, vehicles which the enforcement officers use, which are logoed up, and we've got offices at King's Lynn and a satellite office in Lowestoft. One of the things which makes us potentially unusual as a district is we are a high demand area in terms of other things that are going on in the area. Now, some of those are going on within the 6 Mile district, others are going on outside, but come through our area to make landfall. I haven't got the chart of the UK, but when you compare it to other IFCA districts, there's an enormous amount of offshore activity. With the offshore activity comes a lot of consultations, and our marine science team in particular spend an awful lot of time responding to those consultations. Stephen, who you'll hear from later, has done an enormous amount of work around Sizewell. We've got various different wind farms that are already on stream, and numerous other very large constructions in the pipeline at the moment. They do take a lot of time. We attend planning inspectorate meetings and we take an active part in that consultation. We've also got dredging activities in our area, and more recently we're involved in consultations regarding a new development of aquaculture around seaweed farms, which is something new to our district, but something we're watching very closely. The fishing industry across our district varies. In the north of the district, the focus is around shellfish within the wash, so mussels and cockles. Our cockle fishery, which is currently open, is a hand gathered fishery, in that the fishermen gather the cockles by hand, load them onto the bags and bring them back in. Currently we don't have an active mussel fishery apart from a relaying fishery on the Welland Wall. There is a brown shrimp fishery in the Wash and the Norfolk coast, and a significant whelk and crustacea potting industry that stretches across the district. Predominantly any finfish and whitefish fishery tends to be in the south of the district. There's very little in the north, and it does vary as to the amount of potting in the south of the district. We've approximately got 160 active fishing vessels within the district and 179 vessels landed catching to the ports within the district. There's several important fish processing factories within our area, and particularly the Wash, which is predominantly to process whelk, brown shrimp and cockles, and there are also fish processing along the coast for crab and lobster, and the fish market down in Lowestoft. The amount of value placed on fishing was 7.4 million, and you'll see that's a decrease from the 2016 figure of 10 million. I haven't unfortunately got an up-to-date figure for the value of fish and shellfish landed in the district, but as you see over that period it had declined. There are peaks and troughs which are affected. We had the beast from the east, which heavily affected the crab and lobster industry and potentially has got a knock-on effect for them at the moment. The cockle industry this year, although we've got a large tack, the cockles are very sparsely. The density across the wash is quite light, so it's very difficult for them to gather the cockles. So it can be impacted on a number of different ways, but still an important industry for the local fishermen and the local communities that are reliant on the industry in their areas. Another thing that's unique to our Eastern IFCA district is the amount of designations. If you can see at the top of our area up towards Cleethorpes, you will see there are very few areas where there isn't a designation of some sorts, be it an MCZ, an SPA, a SAC. I think the figure I've got here at the moment, and that potentially will expand, is that 96% of the Eastern IFCA district is covered by MPAs, which means as a regulator there is an awful lot for our officers to contend with, and to make sure that we're managing those protected areas as best we can. What we do, as I mentioned earlier, the IFCA is broken down into different teams. We have the Marine Protection Team. They are responsible for development and review of bylaws. A big part of the IFCA role is engagement with both the fishing industry and recreational sea anglers. They provide a visual presence and deterrent on the coast. Our primary function, and the way we always like to work, is through engagement and education, but we do have an enforcement role, and occasionally we do need to move into that area where we will carry out investigation of offences, which can ultimately lead to a sanction, including progression through to court. The marine science team do a lot of the work in the background. The evidence that they gather underpins our bylaws and how we're going to manage our marine environment. They carry out stock assessments to enable fisheries. They carry out various different studies. We're currently doing a lot of work within Chroma MCZ around impacts of fishing gear on the rugged chalk features. We've just completed surveys off in a dowsing and race bank, looking at red risk interactions of gear with the Savile area in that area. We work in partnership with our county councils. We've got 2 neighbouring IFCA districts, which are North Eastern and Kent and Essex. However, we do work very closely with IFCAs across the country. We have MMO colleagues who are based in our office at King's Lynn when the office is open, and we also have officers working out of the MMO office in Suffolk. We have close working relationships with Natural England, who obviously we need to work with in terms of the advice they give us, and we carry out joint patrols with the Environment Agency, Border Force, and particularly the police. In terms of our stakeholders, we very much see commercial fishers as a stakeholder, recreational sea anglers, conservation groups, and all the other sea users we have around the area, from sailors, kayakers, and particularly in the Wash and Norfolk coast, we're involved in various different partnerships, looking at how everybody can access the most valuable resource we've got around the country, which is the sea. Marine protection team, as I said, proportionate enforcement is what we do. We've got numerous local bylaws which the officers are out looking for compliance with, but we're also implementing EU and national regulations. Any EU legislation that we're working to has been brought over into UK domestic law. Another huge part of our enforcement is around the Wash Fishery Order 1992, which is the cockle fishery, the mussel fishery, and everything that goes on in the Wash. The marine science team carry out a significant amount of survey work that has unfortunately been curtailed over the last 12 months due to COVID. We've had to significantly scale back the work that we've been able to do in terms of on the vessels, in that we've had to maintain an enforcement presence. It has meant that we haven't been able to carry out the survey regime that we had planned for the last year. There's a few pictures there of the different types of surveys that the marine science team will carry out. Like I said, we've currently just got back on track, and we're doing some ROV surveys off Chroma at the current time. One of our biggest surveys is the annual cockle stock assessment. This doesn't reflect the survey that we did this year. We've slightly changed it, but we have to gather over 1,000 sample stations grabs, which influences our assessment of the cockle fishery within the Wash. We measure the length, width and weight of the cockles, and the science team work out the size cohorts, which then gives us an indication of what we can set the TAC at for that year for the industry. It runs from March through to the end of May. A report's written and that's taken to the authority to determine whether a fishery will be open. It's an enormous undertaking for the officers, and we do have to battle around weather and potential vessel breakdowns, but it does take a lot of the officers' time during the spring. Another survey, which again is important in the Wash, is the mussel surveys. It's just an example of what a mussel bed in the Wash looks like. We work out the area of the mussel bed, and then from that they do transects and work out the density. One of the things that the Wash is suffering from at the moment is mortality of both cockles and mussels, and we're working with CFAS currently to try to understand why we're getting the die-off of both mussels and cockles, because we're not seeing the recruitment into the fishery that we'd like, and we need to understand that better. But that's something that we're working with our partners to try to understand a lot better than we currently do. Another area of work, I've just mentioned that we've been doing survey work off Inner Dowsing and Race Bank. We will use side-scan sonar. We take day grabs. We've got drop-down video cameras, and through the work that we're doing, we can identify the types of seabed and habitat. A lot of our red risk areas that I've mentioned before, which are closed areas to bottom toe gear, are in response to Sabellaria, and that's something that we have ongoing monitoring programs that we're considering whether those areas are there. It does move around, but it is a red risk feature, so we do close that to bottom toe gear. Stephen probably can answer any questions anybody's got on some of the surveying that we do. To enable the fisheries in the wash, there is ongoing monthly monitoring. We've currently got a sonde buoy on station in the wash, which is measuring chlorophyll, nutrient, salinity and turbidity and temperature at 10-minute intervals. The sonde that's in there that needs to be taken out once a month and the data looked at. In addition to that, we collect various samples of both cockles and mussels across the wash to test for the environmental health teams of Lincolnshire, Fenland and King's Lynn, West Norfolk, that the cockles and mussels are coming off are fit for human consumption. That's really important. If the classifications of those beds were to fail, that would mean that the fishery would potentially have to close. So it's something that we do need to make sure, again, that we do on a monthly basis. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, an enormous amount of time and effort goes into consultation. Last year, in 2019-2020 period, we had 106 consultation responses that we responded to, and it shows you on the slide just the scale of consultations that we have coming in. There's very rarely a week where we've not got a new consultation coming in. The biggest by far is for offshore renewable energies. Our priorities for 2021 are set out. So it's to ensure that the conservation objectives of the marine protected areas in the district are furthered. We're coming to the end of assessing our red risk features. Inner Dowsing, Race Bank, Northridge was the last one. But as with anything, we're always moving on to the next thing. So our next large piece of work, which Steve is our project lead for, is the Chroma Shoal chalk bed and potential interactions with the chalk features with fishing gear. We're developing monitoring and control plans. We're completing assessments of our amber and green feature interactions again with fishing gear, and from that we'll be developing management, and we're looking at effort management of the shrimp fishery within the wash. So again, the wash does feature heavily in a lot of the work we do. It's one of our largest fisheries, so one of the things we're looking at the moment is the replacement of the several order. We're carrying out a social and economic study of the wash cockle fishery. We're looking at the wash fishery order policies, and we're looking to replace the wash fishery order 1992 with a permit bylaw, because we believe that's the better mechanism to manage the fishery moving forward. And we're continuing to review in relation to access of the fisheries. In terms of industry viability, we're looking, and I've already said about the investigation to mussel die-off within the wash. We haven't been able to open the fishery for the last 2 years, and they've only opened a relaying fishery in the last 3. Finally, Steve's going to move on to fisheries data. One of the things that we're moving towards is better understanding of what the industry are doing. So we're fully behind the implementation of IVMS. It has been slowly working on behind the skis nationally. Locally though, we have looked at other technology that we can use to look at fishing activity. Stephen and the project team that have been looking at chroma have been looking at vehicle trackers, which seem to be working quite well in demonstrating where vessels are moving around in relation to the rugged chalk in the chroma area. So that's just bringing that to my end of my presentation, so we could take some questions.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've had a couple of questions come through. So thank you to members of the audience that have sent those through, and keep them coming. We've got roughly 15 minutes for questions, and 2 so far. So kicking off with the first one, is the decline in landings a longer term decline or just an anomaly as a result of COVID and other climatic drivers?
I think it's a difficult one to say because the fishing industry goes through the peaks and troughs. For example, the whelk fishery has seen total collapse in the past, and it's rebuilt itself. We've certainly seen species moving around. As I understand it, bass wasn't something that was commonly seen. It's now being seen further and further north. So certainly species move in. Cod, for example, and Alan can probably comment on this, was a species that was seen off the the sort of Suffolk and Norfolk coast. Cod's not been seen as common of late. The beast for the east certainly had an impact on the crab and lobster industry. So again, there's certainly things that have changed and influenced landings in the district. Herring, again, for example, it saw a total collapse. It's obviously gone out of fashion, but herring is quite plentiful now. But as a commercial fishery, isn't highly targeted because there actually isn't really a market for it. A lot of herring that's landed is blocked up into big blocks of ice and sent to zoos for animal food. So there's certainly been a change. There's obviously less vessels landing into the district than there has been historically. Stephen's just popped in there. So there was a decline in value in 2019. What we saw was sales particularly were impacted by the lack of the hospitality sector. So a lot of fishermen would have been selling things like crab and lobster to restaurants, pubs along the coast. They had to modify their businesses. A lot moved over to direct sales to the public, although I know Alan's in regular contact. There's far more fish sheds and fishmongers down in the Suffolk area. Some found it and worked quite well. Others found it extremely difficult to get their product out to market. Some have adapted extremely well, others haven't have managed that exchange quite as well. You've gone mute, Hannah.
Oh, sorry about that. So brilliant, thank you. So the next question is, okay, actually on the same topic, how is climate change affecting the food sources for the changing available species? And that's from Tony Hills.
Stephen, is that one you can answer at all?
Yeah, if that's all right. Everybody hear me?
Yep, brilliant.
Very, very much so indeed. It's been a big driver in the distribution of species of fish, and the two biggest you can see in that instance connected with this are cod and bass, where basically cod has effectively moved out of the North Sea because of their food having moved out. If you look at the distribution of the copepods which cod larvae feed on, they've moved north hundreds of kilometres, 100 kilometres plus, and the cod have followed them. And concomitant increase in bass populations in the southern North Sea has come in on the back of the warmer seawater temperatures, which of course have an effect directly on the fish, but very, very importantly have an effect on the type and the amount of food which is present. So climate change in the sea is a very, very big driver, and we will be coming on to some of that later. But it's a very, very big driver, and it's interesting that the southern North Sea is the sea in Europe which is warming the quickest rate. So we are seeing very, very big differences, and we will carry on seeing them as well. But yeah, the climate effect on the food availability is a very, very big determinant on what fish are found in an area.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. Can't wait to learn more about that later. So going back to this is the final question that we've got, unless any more come through. We do have some more time for questions, so if anyone in the audience has a burning one, please do send it through. So this one's from Nigel, and he asks, how have finfish landing patterns changed in the last decade? Have they increased or decreased?
Okay, Nevin's just asked us to have a pause in between each speaker, I can see, so he can have a chance to swap over. But Alan's been around as an inshore fishery officer probably for the longest period of time, so and he's a keen RSA fisherman himself, so I'm going to put that one over to Alan. If you just hang on a minute, Alan, and Nevin will swap us over. You've gone live now.
Yeah, sure. Okay, Hannah, can you just put that question over again, please?
Yep, no problem. Bear with me just a moment. So how have finfish landing patterns changed in the last decade? Have they increased or declined?
Okay, locally in our district, they've certainly declined, going down annually. A lot of this is the changing of the species. As both others have mentioned, the cod have declined. They've been replaced with other species, bass, and especially wombat grey. Other people call them skate. They're in abundance. They're here all year now, whereas before they were only here for 2 months. And moving on from that, I also think the landings are down to there's less boats, there's less activity, there's less fishermen fishing, and not only that, at the moment with so much going on with the wind farms and survey, and they're being keeping out of the areas where they normally fish. They're being paid to do this as a aid for compensation, and obviously you've got so much percentage of fish that's being caught. So that's the quick answer to that, just in Suffolk and Norfolk.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alan. So going back to, well, I guess it's open to whoever's best to answer the question. But the last one before going on to the next section with Stephen is there a possibility that bluefin tuna will end up on our coastline here in Eastern IFCA?
Stephen's put his hand up. He's nodding there.
Okay, can we go, Nevin?
Yep, go.
Yes, one would sincerely hope so. As you probably well know, there was a very, very strong bluefin tuna fishery out of Scarborough and Whitby in the 1930s. It seems to have declined very much on the back of the herring population. When the herring population crashed because of overfishing, it seems as though that was what basically caused the tuna population to crash. The herring population in the North Sea is now back. Several decades of intensive management have resulted in the herring population coming back. And we are seeing a bluefin tuna population, as you'll all know, now coming into the southwest approaches of the UK. I haven't seen many reports of them getting into the North Sea yet, but their food is there. Certainly the temperature of the water is right for them now. There's no reason why not, and they can swim hundreds of kilometres in a day. If they're off Cornwall, it wouldn't take them very long to find their way in there. So definitely hope so, yes.
Brilliant, thank you. And with that, there's no further questions at this time, but thank you to everyone in the audience that took the time to send those through, and please do keep them coming. So if it's okay with you, Stephen, I'll hand over to you for the next part of the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you tell me, please, which makes sense.
Yeah, you're live now, Stephen.
Okay, thank you. And can you see the first presentation, Angling Trust webinar?
Yeah, we can.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along and for us having this opportunity. What I want to look at now is a nice drill down into fishing for data, how everybody can get involved and make a difference, and why it matters. As John has said, our area, our district, covers the counties of Lincolnshire, Norfolk and Suffolk, which is a very, very interesting point of view, a very interesting position from the point of view of sea temperatures. If we look here, warm colours of being warm seawater surface temperature and cooler colours being cooler seawater temperature, you can see that Lincolnshire, Norfolk and Suffolk are right over the boundary between where the warm water from the Channel affects the southern North Sea and the cold waters of the North Sea butt up against that. So we have a very distinct front usually off the Suffolk coast. This results in the fact that over our coastline, the relatively short distance of our coastline in our district, we have probably one of the biggest changes of fish populations of anywhere around the English coast over a similar sort of distance, because we have such a massive change in temperature over a relatively short distance, especially down in the Suffolk coastline. This image was taken in spring, so we can see that particularly in spring there's a very, very big difference in seawater temperature between Suffolk up to about as far as Sizewell and the northern part of our district. Seawater temperatures in spring are particularly important because that is when a lot of the juvenile fish are coming into their nursery areas, the inshore areas, and warmer waters are more productive, warmer waters are easier for many species of fish to survive in, so the seawater temperature at that time of year makes a really, really big difference. So that's, it's like the global picture around the UK. And I believe this actually because I learned to dive off the coast of County Durham, and if I'd seen this then, I would have got a thicker wetsuit. It's the coldest part of the UK, not the north of Scotland, it's the northeastern coast of England, which is the coldest part of the UK. But if we look in a bit more depth at our particular coastline, I'm sorry, this gets a bit blurry when you blow it up, you can see that we have a front in between cold water from the North Sea and warm water from the Channel, which is somewhere off the Suffolk coast. Within our district, we have the results of a range of fish surveys which have been conducted over various times a year at various places throughout the district. These tend to have been in estuaries or inshore protected areas because they are the most interesting places to look at for a population of fish which are going to feed into the population of larger fish in the sea. And if we look at one species which I'm sure is of most interest to, great interest to most of us, the bass, we see that there's a very nice correlation between southern estuaries where there's high numbers of bass found on average in each survey, which tails away very nicely as you go north, and there's a nice change when you go across that difference between warm water and cold water. As I'm sure you've noticed, there is one standout result, and that standout result, interestingly, is Breydon Water, which on average has returned a very, very high number of bass. It's a very important bass nursery very important nursery area for bass. It's interesting that Breydon Water is a very large, shallow area of water which warms up a lot during the summer. And a lot of these surveys were actually taken in the later part of the year, whereas the sea surface temperature graph is for the early part of the year. So the bass in Breydon Water have a lot of warm water, a very warm environment and a productive environment that they can make the most of in the summer and late summer, but then they all have to move out of there in the winter because it gets really fairly chilly. So this is one of the very interesting things that you can start to pull out when you have quite a lot of survey information, quite a lot of data, which covers a large area and quite a large period of time. You can start to follow trends and understand what's happening in an area. In this particular case, this was due to a natural phenomenon, seawater temperature. We might be able to pull out trends which are due to either fishing pressure or pollution or some other effect. But with bass, it's a very, very nice clear picture for seawater temperature having an effect on increasing populations. The data for flounder is pretty much the inverse of this. They're much more prevalent in the north of the district than they are in the south, and we keep hearing reports from the southern part of the district or the southern part of England that flounder numbers are going down, whereas in actual fact flounder is more a cold water species of fish, and the populations are probably just being displaced north as the water warms further north. This is particularly interesting because within the Eastern IFCA district, there are no designated legislative bass nursery areas, which I'm sure you'll all be familiar with. But that designation was based on decisions which were taken in the 1970s, 1980s, based on the distribution of bass at that time. And since then, there have been an awful lot of changes. A lot of the bass nursery areas at that time, the legislative bass nursery areas, were around warm water power station outflows of warm water where bass populations were held there. And as I say, there weren't any in our part of the world because at that time there simply weren't any bass nurseries. The water wasn't warm enough for them. A CFAS study's been looking at this over several years, and although the study is actually dated 2018, this study was only published a couple of weeks ago, 23rd of June this year, which has looked at the presence of European sea bass and other species in proposed bass nursery areas. various bodies, including all the IFCAs, were asked to suggest areas within their remit where they thought there were actually biological bass nursery areas, and then there's an examination conducted to see if they should be designated, as you like, as legislated bass nursery areas. So for our district, these are the ones which the report identifies there is sufficient evidence to support further consideration as a legislated bass nursery area. So there are many of the sites we've identified in the previous slides as was where there are surveys happening: the Alden, the Orr, Blakeney, Bredenwater, Deben, Orwell, Stour, Sizewell and Stour. All those estuaries and all those inshore waters are now defined as bass nursery areas, as indeed is the Sizewell power station because of the effect of the warm water outflow there on the bass populations. There were, however, some where there wasn't enough data to support the designation as a legislative bass nursery area. So although these, which are predominantly in the North Norfolk area, although these, there is no doubt that bass use them, there wasn't sufficient data, sufficient evidence available to support their inclusion as legislative bass nursery areas. Sort of information that's available is this. This is a picture taken from the report, the page taken from the report for the River Deben. The amount of information which is needed is not all that great. It's not a huge scientific tome. Many of these surveys, several of these surveys in the Deben, ones that we conducted, the Eastern IFCA conducted, some of the other ones were conducted by citizen science groups. But between them, there's 5 or 6 survey points there which were sufficient to enable designation of the Deben as a bass nursery area, because it's clear and unequivocal that small bass are using that estuary as a nursery, so therefore it can be considered for designation as a legislative bass nursery area. So that is one information, that is one instance where it's been very clear and very evident that having evidence, documented evidence available, has fed through directly into management and policy. Other things you can start to pull out when you have a lot of information available is, this is the Stour and the Orwell distribution of, again, bass of various sizes at various points in the estuary. And you can see that there's a couple of year classes identified there, which you can tell by the different peaks in the graphs, different peaks of different sizes of fish. But from that you can pull out the conclusion that smaller fish use points further up the estuary. That will come as no surprise to anybody on this call, but you need the evidence for that. So there's a difference between, if you like, knowing something and being able to prove it. And evidence like this enables us to prove it. So this is hard evidence, which is very, very useful and has been used to support both the Stour and the Orwell as bass nursery areas in the future. This is from Environment Agency Water Framework Directive monitoring. It was legislative requirement for the Environment Agency to conduct monitoring of UK estuaries, but due to economic constraints they weren't able to monitor all of the estuaries, so some of them were never done under the Water Framework Directive programme, the Deben being one, which is why we did our own surveys in the Deben. And the Environment Agency are now having to pull back from this monitoring again because of financial constraints. They just can't afford to do all the monitoring, and they now have a lot of the information that was needed. But this information still has real value in the future, because this change in fish populations, which we've seen over the past 20-30 years, is not going to stop. It's going to carry on, and we are going to start seeing more and more species of fish coming into our district, and it'd be very, very helpful and beneficial for management to be able to pick up these changes in fish distribution. For instance, we will see the gilt-head sea bream coming into our district, relatively soon, within a couple of decades. It's moving its way along the English Channel as the waters get warmer. Now people can consistently fish for gilt-head sea bream off the southwest of England, and it's moving its way up the channel towards us. It will get here in the next 20 years or so. Seahorses are very likely to turn up in greater abundance. So this time series data, which goes on over a long period of time, is very, very useful to have. But as with all bodies, nobody like the Environment Agency has the money, the resources to carry on doing as much as they would like in doing this. So we are looking, if you like, for other sources of this information. And one which has been extremely useful has been what's termed citizen science. There's nothing at all pejorative meant by the term citizen science. It is real science. And these fish survey work is done very much along this basis. It is not particularly complex. It is literally going out with us in the shallow water with a relatively small net, seeing what fish are there, counting them, measuring them, and then writing a brief report about it. This one here was one that was actually done in Sussex, Pagham Harbour, but it's one that very similar to ones that we've done ourselves here. In fact, we were doing one a week or so ago, but because it was so muddy, nobody had time to take any photographs, so we don't have any photographs of our own activity. But the these citizen science surveys are very, very simple to do and produce very, very useful data. The equipment and the techniques involved are not complex. There are some protocols that have to be followed, but they are extremely useful bits of information. In terms of surveys, the bigger they are, the longer they go on for, the better. Especially useful when you have data which goes on over a prolonged period of time series data, because then you're able to pick up changes. So we're able to pick up bass turning up in different areas. We're able to pick up, for instance, flounders declining in some areas, but when you see the big picture of what's happening over large areas, you see that it isn't a sort of a decline in the flounder population. It's probably a shift in it. So we were able to see whether changes in populations are due to decline in the overall population, or whether they're due, for instance, to movement of that population. And it's very important to know the difference when you try to manage the impacts on fish populations. So the larger the area the surveys are done over and the longer they go on for, the better. So how can people get involved? How can people help with this? Well, the citizen science surveys is something which is ongoing and is building a bit of momentum. So if anybody has the opportunity to participate in these, which we are trying to instigate and nudge along through organisations such as wildlife trusts and river associations, I'm sure anybody who's taken the effort to get onto this call would find these very, very useful and interesting, and they do produce genuinely useful results. One other point which is particularly interesting in connection with sea angling is that it would be very, very beneficial for us. I've tried several times to get hold of sea angling match results. And the reason these would be particularly valuable is that in many instances, sea angling matches are held in the same place at the same time of year for years. So you have a sampling event which is happening in the same place at the same time of year ongoing. So it gives you very, very valuable time series data, which has a lot of value in terms of supporting science. The effort that's put in, so catch, to express abundance of fish, you have to put it in catch per unit effort. So for instance, if you caught 100 fish, was that because there was 100 people fishing or because one person caught 100 fish? So you need to know the amount of effort that's gone in. Sea angling matches, this is well recorded. You know the number of rods fishing and you know the time the match is fished over. So you have a very good measure of the fishing effort which has been used, and you can then put the catch into catch per unit effort, which gives you a very, very much better figure than just the total number of fish that were caught by a guy fishing for a day, for instance. In a match, it's reasonable to assume that everyone is fishing as well as they possibly can. They're not just, when I go fishing, I sometimes, if a fish comes along, it's a bit of a distraction. I just want to be out there with a bait in the water. But in a match, it's reasonable to assume that everybody's fishing as well as they can. So the results are indicative of what's actually in the water at that time. And also the fish are all identified and recorded correctly and accurately. So you get very, very useful information. Some sea angling match results could be very, very beneficial in helping us all to understand much better what's happening with fish populations in the sea. And there are far more sea anglers than there are marine science officers in the Eastern IFCA district. So this could be very, very useful information. For example, this is some data I did get from one match result, and I looked at whiting. They were the most abundant species of fish caught here. And this is, if you like, the size distribution, the percentage of fish of each size fraction within the catches reported there. And even this very, very small amount of information produces some evidence that might indicate that there were two year classes of whiting present there. There might have been some which were 1 year old, and there might have been some there which were 2 years old. So if there was more data which went on in this way, if this match results were available year on year, it'd be very interesting to see how the relative proportion of those different year classes changes over time. It's a very important factor in fisheries stock management. Looking at the same results, one interesting point was that if I looked at ranked the number of fish caught by anglers from the greatest number caught by an angler down to the lowest, it was evident that this was a reasonable sample, because it wasn't that there was one superb angler who was fishing far better than everybody else who caught 90% of the fish. There was a good distribution of fish caught by a good range of anglers. So this was a really genuine, valuable sample. If we look at the sort of thing that could be developed from this data, for instance, this is fictitious data, as you can probably tell from the fact it runs from the year 2025 to the year 2035. But if we were to year on year pick up a picture like that, we'll be able to say, well, yeah, okay, so it looks like the numbers of whiting, for instance, are going down. But the number of bass are coming up. Well, that might well be indicative of the fact that whiting, a relatively cold water species, is moving out of the area. Bass, a relatively warm water species, is moving into the area. So we can pull out useful information like that. However, smooth curves like that are quite unusual in fish stocks, and they're actually, to be honest, they're not all that interesting. The most interesting ones are ones where they're a bit more jagged and a bit more jumpy. So if, for instance, we were to get a one like this, and again, I stress that these are fictitious figures, what happened in 2030 was somebody invented a wonder bait, which meant that everybody was catching more fish in the matches, or did fish populations suddenly jump? Well, my assessment from that would be that actually fish populations jumped, because if it was a wonder bait, all you would expect would be that the lines translated upwards a little bit, but then carried on the same trend as before. But what's happened there is actually the trend, and it's trend which is more important in many instances than just absolute numbers. The trends have actually changed. So that would seem to indicate that something happened in 2030 to make a big difference to the fish populations. So those are some of the things which are very, very useful in developing management measures. We've seen very recently how such information, such relatively simple, straightforward and not complex information can feed directly into policy and management by the designation of bass nursery areas. And we've also seen a couple of areas where I think that everybody on this call could have a real input. So I'd be very interested to see if anybody has any questions at this point. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Stephen. We've had quite a few questions come through now. So starting with the first one. Tony asks, do you have any projected development of bass fisheries with the increase of temperatures? The EA are working on a 4-degree rise by the end of the century.
We haven't done the projections of what will happen with the bass fisheries within our district. Things like that are probably better done on a national scale. I know that EA and CFAS are looking at this. I think one thing to bear in mind with bass is it still is pretty much at the northern edge of its distribution in English waters, a little bit further up the east coast of England now than used to be the case, say 30 years ago, but it still is pretty much at its northern limit of distribution. And it is, for that reason, a fairly, if you like, fragile fish. Its stocks are fairly fragile. Some years you get very good recruitments and they feed through into the adult fish in the sea. Some years you get relatively poor recruitments, and I have to say, from what I've seen so far this year, unfortunately, it's looking like a relatively poor year. It looks like in the sea it was a fairly late and slow spring, and it looks like it's not going to be a particularly brilliant year for bass this year, from what I've seen so far from small fish survey results. In our area, bass are a relatively fragile species of fish because they are at the northern limit of their distribution. If you move further south into areas which are more, if you like, in the core of the bass distribution, such as the French coast of the Bay of Biscay, bass is effectively a completely different fish. It recruits into the fishery every year and is a much more reliable fish. There's much less need to be, if you like, precious about the management of it because it's a much stronger fish stock. We are still at the northern edge of its distribution, and for that reason the management has to be really quite precautionary. It may well be that if we do end up more in the middle of the bass's distribution, we can be a lot less precious about its management.
Great, thank you. So moving on, the next question is from Nigel, and he asks, how willing are the IFCAs to authorise netting licences? This is sign net or trawl permits to citizen scientists.
Okay, if I am to be corrected, please correct me quickly, John, Alan. But for many of these surveys, there isn't actually a need for a permit. There is something called the public right to fish, and as long as you're meeting certain criteria about certain activities which are not permitted in certain areas and certain types of activity which are not permitted, and retention of small fish, then in fact for many of these there isn't an absolute requirement for permitting. However, we would always like people to talk to us because we can always clarify that. We are very, very well in some instances to issue derogations. We have in the past issued derogations for these sorts of sampling programs against some of our bylaws which are enforced in some areas. So always talk to us, always ask us, and we might very well like to be involved, and we'd certainly be very interested in any information you develop.
Great, thank you.
Hannah, can I just come in on that as well?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Nevin switches me over.
Yes, yeah, brilliant. I think we're ready to go.
Okay. Yeah, one of the things Stephen actually took me out on for the first time last week was a fish survey at Hazelmere near Aldeburgh. I think it might have been a bit of a sales pitch on behalf of some of the community groups there to get involved in some fish surveys, but I certainly think as an IFCA what we're looking to do is actually purchase some equipment that we can loan out to citizen science groups to try to gather some of the data. I think you'll have got from some of my earlier slides that one of the things we suffer from is we've got a lot of high profile pieces of work that we've got to get done, and unfortunately some of the fish surveys, which Stephen's very passionate about, we'd like to get done, fall by the wayside. So if we could have projects around the coast that are gathering some of this information on our behalf, and we can feed that into our own studies, I think a small amount of investment in terms of getting some of the kit for some of these citizen science groups would go a long way. So that's certainly something that Stephen's managed to get across to me last week while I was out with him.
If I could just come back on that as well, if I may.
Thank you. Yeah, of course. Just need to switch the screens over. Good to go.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much, John. That's great. I just noticed that the question also included trawl. Now, trawl is a very different matter. That is something where it is very likely that there would be a need for a significant amount of permitting and authorisation. The beach seines which are used in this sampling and other types of techniques which are used, the permitting process is quite straightforward. Trawling much more complex. And I was very interested as well to see something from Mike Watts. Yes, please. Very much an offer of data.
Yes, we've had, I was just going to mention that actually we've had quite a few different offers of data from various different sources from members of the audience. So I will collate all of those and send them over. So thank you very much for all of those offers.
Thank you.
So moving on, we have a question that you may or may not be able to answer, and that's from Nigel about the about bluefin tuna. And he says the Danes are in the process of agreeing a swap with the Spanish for a small bluefin tuna quota. They are giving mackerel from the British Atlantic coast in exchange for this tuna quota for Danish waters. Is this a possibility for the UK? Now, I know you're going to be giving a forum later in the year, Stephen, about bluefin tuna, which you may answer this then, but any responses would be great.
Okay, I'll have to talk to you about that forum. I didn't know about it. But,
sorry, I was informed by Nevin that you were delivering one later in the year. Okay,
I'm always interested to follow it. That is something which wouldn't really be done at the IFCA level. That would have to be done at a national level by DEFRA, who would assist that. I know that there is some examination of the possibility of catch and release associated with tagging programs for some of the bluefin tuna, but it's one of these instances where it actually legislation and policy and management often move less quickly than the fish do.
Hannah, if I could just come in on that as well.
Yeah, of course, John. Yeah, just bear with us a moment. Ready to go.
I think not to shock Steve, I think Nevin might have been referring to somebody different than our Stephen.
Okay.
In terms of the bluefin tuna, I know, and I've been copied into emails, although we haven't got ourselves involved in it, that the MMO and some of the South Coast IFCAs are certainly looking at bluefin tuna in terms of potentially as a quota species and having a limited amount of quota there, but I don't know very much about it, but I know it's something that's been looked at as bluefin appear more commonly along the south coast. So I think it's a watch this space, and obviously it's a Steve Murphy. I think Nevin's saying that he's doing the forum later on in the year, so he may have more details about that then.
Yeah, my problem didn't make the connection. The heat is getting to me, I think.
So certainly be interested to know about that and probably listen in.
Yep, I thoroughly recommend it. It should be a good presentation. So the next question is from Alan, and he asks, should there be a bylaw introduced to protect the breeding stocks of mature bass until after they have spawned? This generally appears to be around early June in this area.
Do you want me to take that one, Stephen?
Yep, that's fine. Yep.
Yeah. Am I on? Yeah. Eastern IFCA did look at a potentially emergency bylaw a number of years ago now, and it's something we obviously keep under review. We do get message forms for both commercial fishers and recreational fishers around bass spawning and bass landing with roe. At the time we last looked at this, it was decided that it didn't warrant any further regulation other than the current national legislation that's in place in terms of when bass can be landed. In our district, and Steve has already hinted at it, bass are just sort of emerging into our area, but the bass itself is a very important species for commercial fishermen. And you know, the few bass that they do land are incredibly important to them in terms of financial viability. So it was decided that, again, it's about this balance, that as it stands at the moment, we're not looking to implement any further local bylaws or legislation, and we'll follow the national legislation in terms of bass. But it goes back to what Stephen says about data. The more data we have, means that it's something that we would look back at again in the future, and if we felt that bass stocks were being particularly hit before they could spawn, then that might be something that we'd need to look at again. But again, it's about that balance. At the moment, we feel that the correct approach is to follow national legislation.
Brilliant, thank you. So I have a comment from Mike Watts who says for Holt SAC, he's previously offered up data, but doesn't appear to have been taken up. So is there a way of providing that data in the future to the IFCA?
Can I take that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I mean, any data is always worth having and of interest. The problem we have is finding the time to process it. So if data is available just, if you like, in written form, or I see somebody noted it's in Facebook, the time that it takes us to actually get that data and get it into a form that we can process is something that makes it very, very difficult for us to deal with. So if it was available in spreadsheet form, or if we could come up with a program where anybody who is willing to sort of be involved in this process was prepared to take those card records and put them onto a spreadsheet, that would be incredibly valuable to us, because it is very, very difficult to find the time to take that number of card records and put them into a form that can be subsequently processed. So it may well, this is the issue. It's the data is there. The problem, if you like, is getting into a form that can then be moved and transferred so that we can do some analysis and processing on it. And that's something where I'd be very, very happy to talk with people about. If there's a willingness to record this in a way where we can use it directly, that would be fantastic. If there's a possibility of designing a project where somebody wants to spend some time being involved for this and is prepared to take the data and put it into a spreadsheet form, that again would be really, really helpful.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry, I'm just looking through the questions. So the next question is from Nigel, and he says, does the Eastern IFCA get access to OWF fish survey data and when such surveys are carried out? I'm not quite sure personally what he means by OWF. Offshore
wind farms?
Potentially. I've asked for clarification, but I haven't received it yet.
Okay, so if it is offshore wind farms, a lot of the data which is done in connection with surveys for the offshore wind farms is proprietary data. It's done by commercial operations, and a lot of it is proprietary in confidence. We do see data from a lot of sources, and people like CFAS are very, very keen at getting data from as many sources as they can, and we do keep in touch with those. We do sometimes as well see data from offshore wind farm surveys because we have good relationships with the offshore wind farm developers, good professional relationships with the offshore wind farm developers, and with people such as the Environment Agency and some of the contractors doing their surveys. So we do see some of that data. Some of it we're allowed to use, some of it we're not allowed to use in further ways, and some of it we just don't get to see. But I have to say, I think that there is relatively little data on fish in connection with offshore wind farms. There is always some, but most of the data is in connection with things like benthic sampling, crab sampling, and sampling little wee beasties in the mud.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just scanning to check that I've got all the questions. Yes, Nigel's confirmed offshore wind farms. Thank you for that. Just because I don't want to miss any before saying that we're closed. But it seems as though we have answered every single question. So unless there's any more in the next couple of minutes, it's the final call for questions from members of the audience. There we go. We've got one through from Alan. And he says, are the fish stocks within the waters in our area becoming unbalanced? For example, 40 years ago, whiting were an autumn-only species. Now they can be caught all year round.
Well, certainly stocks are changing in many, many ways. I mean, unbalance would imply that there's something, if you like, unnatural about it. And a lot of the changes are due to changes in climate, changes in seawater temperature. Quite a lot of changes as well are actually due to reductions in pollution, which have happened over the last 50 years or so. This is true in some of our areas, but it's particularly true in places like the Thames and the Thames estuary, where the Thames was biologically dead in 1977 or something, was declared biologically dead. Thames estuary is now one of the most important sole nurseries in the North Sea. So there are definitely changes in fish populations, but whether they're becoming unbalanced or not, I suppose that depends on your perspective, isn't it? You always sort of think back to the good old days, and any change since then is a bad thing. But in fact, a lot of the changes are due to climate change. Now, you know, whether that is a natural event or not is up for debate. It's not really something that we're going to decide on, but that is the driver of a lot of the changes. And a lot of the changes as well are due to reduction in pollution in many places.
Brilliant, thank you. So Peter's asked, can you advise when new bass nursery areas may be designated?
They've already been recommended by that report that was published back end of June. And if this presentation is being made public, that report is publicly available. The website where you can get hold of that report is listed in there. When they will be designated, that depends how DEFRA are minded to take forward the management of bass nursery areas, whether they take these recommendations and how quickly that moves through the legislative process. Unfortunately, we know from our own experience that anything moving through the legislative process with DEFRA takes a very, very, very long time. It takes us a minimum of 2 years to get a bylaw in place. So unfortunately, no, doesn't look like any time soon, unless somebody decides they have a will to do so and they want it to move quickly. It's very much now in the hands of the lawmakers.
Brilliant, thank you. So the last question I have here is from Tony, and he asks, a few years ago there were worries about the electrical field from wind farms and its environmental impact. Could you give us any explanation of this and whether there's any further evidence to support that?
It's a very good question, and it is something which is of interest. It's something that we keep raising in our consultations for marine licenses because, as you know, particularly elasmobranchs, skates, rays, dogfish, sharks are particularly sensitive to electric fields, and there's quite a lot of work which there's no doubt that they can detect very, very low level electric fields. There's work now which is indicating that now we have a few years experience of operating wind farms. It seems that there isn't a massive step change in the distribution of fish within them or abundance of fish within them. So it seems as though, if you like, there isn't a clear and immediate negative effect. But there seems little doubt that the fish can detect them, and there's increasing evidence as well that other species can detect them as well. Crustaceans can detect electric fields, some at the levels that they're tending to find them. So yes, it is an effect, but it doesn't look like it's not a huge red flag straight away. When we're looking at the data we've got now over several years of operation in places like North Hoyle, which has been operating at a large scale for a long period of time now.
Great, thank you. So quickly going back to bass, we've had a quick question from Peter, and he asks, how does Eastern IFCA know how many bass are being landed by commercials during the spawning season?
Yeah, good question. As you know, a lot of the official landings figures come from the Marine Management Organisation, and the Marine Management Organisation mandatory returns for fish have cut-off points below which there's no mandatory requirement to report them. A lot of the fisheries in our district, because they're relatively small inshore boats and many of them are selling through local outlets, their catches don't trigger that requirement to report. So a significant number of them are not reported through the official system. The fishermen are not doing anything illegal. That's what the system says. So the fishermen are not doing anything illegal. What we go on ourselves is a lot of the time information from the MMO reports, and also we basically just try and get out and talk to people.
Great, thank you. Sorry.
If Alan has anything you want to say on that?
No, I think that's well answered, Steve.
Great. So just on the same topic of bass, this is a comment from Alan Kettle that you may be able to provide an explanation for. And he says, Ari, the bass spawning question he posed earlier, the national bass ban is February and March so as to enable them to spawn, but the bass in our colder seas do not spawn until after this, and in his view is completely inappropriate. Is there any explanation for this, or an indication that the spawning ban could, the national bass ban could be moved to reflect these spawning periods?
I think that was something that John covered in his answer, that basically that we align with the national ban because there's no option, if you like, to move it. All we could have done would be extend it. And the feeling at the time was that would have a disproportionate effect on the commercial fishermen who depend very, very much on bass.
Great, thank you. Okay, I believe that is all the questions now. Yeah, okay, brilliant. So if there's any further comments, I will filter those back to you, and the suggestions for data collection as well that we mentioned earlier on for citizen science. But other than that, thank you so much, John and Stephen, for your time and for answering the questions this evening. I will now pass over to Nevin Hunter.
Thanks, gents, and thanks for what you've done this evening. Excellent presentations, and the answering to the questions for everyone from the audience has been brilliant. So thank you for that. Just on some of the themes we picked up tonight, if I can just advise everybody, and apologies for the confusion that I caused earlier, because I was messaging in the background to our presenters about Steve presenting on bluefin tuna. I did actually mean Steve Murphy, who we work closely with on bluefin tuna issues, and Steve has promised to do a bluefin tuna forum for us later this year, as so many anglers around the coastline are really interested in the whole development, really, with everything, with both the chart program but also the return of bluefin tuna into UK waters. And just in the last few days, Steve has told us that when we're seeing bluefin tuna later in the year, they've already been seeing east of Start Point down on the south coast. So they are heading your way already. Although, and I'm no expert on this, but I'm assuming they've come around the north of Scotland before in the past when the fisheries are there. But I stand to be corrected on this. I don't have any expertise, but certainly Steve is going to present for us later in the year. So if you are interested, please do follow the information that we put out with that, and I'll cover that in a moment. Something else that's come out from tonight is citizen science. This is something we're always really keen to support. And if any of you have been following our shark forums, and which Hannah has been brilliantly leading on with the Shark Hub, you'll see how important data gathering is, and key that anglers play a part in that. And what we've got really for that's really important with what we've done here is that anglers are going to be providing data, and the scientists that are taking that data and looking at it have agreed that they will come back and provide us updates. So we're going to have a follow-up to the shark survey work that Hannah and the Shark Hub have been leading on later in the year, which should be really interesting for anybody who's got an interest in shark angling issues. But that is really indicative of the work that we're really keen to support around citizen science stuff. So the stuff that Stephen's been talking about tonight is only something that I can see us getting involved with and developing that. And John messaged me as we were going through the presentations earlier, asking if that's something the Angling Trust could be involved with, and I could say, positively we would. And on that score, I just wanted to say as well for everybody that's called in this evening and take not only taken part, but also actually been watching the forum. We are really keen within the Angling Trust now to develop the work that we have with you as sea anglers around the whole coastline. Some have said to me in the role that I've been doing for the last couple of years that we're very southern centric, but we are really keen that we're expanding the work that we do. And if any of you have seen the statements from our chief executive just in the last week, we are really keen that the whole of England and broader is really sees an Angling Trust involvement and support to you as anglers, and hopefully we get that support back as well. I mentioned earlier about a filmed copy of the forum. I know 1 or 2 people have had issues getting in. I hope I've certainly been able to help one person getting in, I hope. And for those of you who have missed any of the forum earlier, it will be available on the website hopefully in the next several days. As soon as we can produce that copy, we'll add it to the sea pages on our website. And in fact, if you didn't know about it already, you can look at any of the forums that we've held with the other IFCAs and those shark forums that I mentioned as well. They're available to look at on our website. And what I'll say to you is feedback for us from these forums is really important, and after this event you'll be receiving a feedback survey from me, and I would just ask that you spend a few minutes completing this online for us over the next 7 days. The survey will help us to deliver what we hope is the best experiences for you for these types of events in the future. We're really keen that we keep this engagement with the IFCAs around the country going, and it may be that you've got particular things that you would like us to be asking the IFCAs to cover on future presentations, either geographically or as a whole, and we're really keen to take those topics on your behalf. But there may be other directly angling related issues you'd like us to cover, so do tell us in those surveys. Tell us what you think of the forums, but also tell us other things that you'd like us to cover. For those of you who have been following the series of IFCA forums, we've worked up from Cornwall starting back in January-February time, and we've got here now with Easton, and we're taking a break for a short period of time over the summer, so we won't be doing any forums in August, but we will be returning on Thursday the 23rd of September, when we will be having as guests the North Eastern IFCA with David McCandless, who's the chief officer there, and David will be covering the issues with his IFCA, and yet again we're hoping for another event that runs for roughly an hour and a half. We find that is what most people have fed back, that they really enjoy it. An hour and a half is enough. It gives you an opportunity to ask lots of questions, and the questions tonight have been really good, so I'm really grateful for that. You can keep up to date with any of the forthcoming forums by signing up to our free monthly Sea newsletter online. You don't have to be a member to that of the Angling Trust to do that. You can subscribe, and we use that as a mechanism. Hannah does a lot of the work on that, and I'll provide some updates for her as well. But that is our mechanism really for you as anglers to get an idea about what we're involved with from a sea angling point of view, what we've been involved with over recent months, what's coming up in the future, and also some of the key things that are coming up nationally as well. So it's a really good feed for you, and for those of you who took part in our member survey a few years ago, just a couple of years ago now, it seems to be the one thing that anybody involved with sea angling that's got an interest in the Angling Trust really does subscribe to and read. So we're always keen to get information out to you as anglers in that. Finally, if I could just thank you yet again for the guys presenting this evening from Eastern IFCA, and I look forward to seeing everybody that's taken part this evening, perhaps at a future forum, but also thank you all as members of the audience for attending this evening, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I've found it really fascinating with some of the questions and answers, and this is a really good way for us to engage and work with anglers, and I hope you agree with that. So thanks again. I look forward to seeing you at the next forum, and for those of you coming to the Northeast, it's just a click away in September. So thanks again, and good night to everybody.
Thank you very much. Cheerio.